today is we're wishing to talk about the relationship between the masculine and the feminine, and we can call this the battle of the sexes, but it wasn't originally a battle. It was originally a cooperation. When we're talking about you as a species and you as, especially back in the Mirabile days, the early days when before you had separated from each other, before you had separated from nature, before you had separated from spirit, there was a was there was a difficulty in understanding anything that would be described as gender roles now, because the dynamics of gender was basically a dynamic of um, it was a mixed metaphor. It was a mixed dynamic of energy. Each of you, whether you had masculine or feminine bodies, had a blended consciousness of which you had both energies available to you at any given time. And there was, again, we described this almost as you have to look at it as water. This is a dynamic of energy that doesn't have a lot of delineation, doesn't have a lot of definition to it. It was more along the lines of, we have described the natural feminine energy as being one of wisdom and one of understanding. But how do you have wisdom if you have no experience? So it was more of a dynamic of that the feminine was that aspect of self, was the dreamer, was the part that brought in new ideas, was the piece that longed to be more, that longed to that had a curiosity and an understanding. And we have often said that in that circumstance, the masculine just kind of wanted to sit in front of the cave and watch Sunday football. But well, that's the analogy. But again, the feminine wonders how the masculine can do that, and the masculine wonders how the feminine can be so occupied with, what shall we say, exploring the twists and turns of reality in great detail and what's the word? Microscopically, right? Well, and so as we have said, and we don't want to get into too much of the simple dynamics, but if you take the dynamics of the medical staff, the sign of medicine in your world, it is a staff surrounded by a snake or two snakes intertwined with each other, you know. So, what's the metaphor here? It is that whole dynamic of that the wholeness requires the ability to make short term decisions that have long term ramifications, but there is also the place for the dynamics of new dreams, and within those new dreams, the details that are necessary for manifestation, that are necessary for creation. And if you're in a position where you just as a species are these things are just beginning to unfold, then you have to realize that there is a level of naivete, there is a level of innocence that you that when the separation, when the dynamics of the your growth happened, because basically you were growing from a childhood as a species into an adolescence as a species, as that began to happen and that began to energize itself in that sort of way, you began to move more. Now, We can say that the Orions came in and taught you about individuation, but, in fact, it was more of an evolutionary dynamic where it took thousands of years rather than. But ultimately, it got to the point where the feminine aspect of self wished to have more, and the masculine just wished to please the feminine and wished to manifest because it was great fun manifesting into the physical, manifesting
Hmm.
the whole dynamics of separation, of movement, of growth. Yes.
No, you're just looking at me quizzically, and I'm trying to read into it.
Well, read what into it is fairly simple in its own dynamics. You're talking about that step up from childhood to adolescence, and that usually happens in your physical lives with what? The adolescent wounding,
Right. And the before that, the
or
feminine.
the adolescent wounding where you realize that you are actually a separate being than your mother slash father.